You have been lied to since your very first history lesson. The scale of this deception is so colossal that it is simply impossible for the average mind to accept. We were told that the 19th century was an era filled with the smell of coal dust, the whistle of steam engines, and marked by humanity's clumsy but proud first steps into the industrial world. They painted us pictures of grimy laborers creating engineering masterpieces by hand, using only the most primitive tools. Masterpieces that even today, with laser scanners, computerized modeling, and powerful cranes, would be incredibly difficult, time-consuming, and expensive to replicate. But pause for a moment and look at the photographs of that time. What do you truly see in those images? It's not just locomotives. You see grandiose arched bridges that span rivers with a precision demanding the most complex calculations. You see gigantic railway stations with intricate, web-like vaults that seem utterly weightless. You see skeleton frame buildings where iron and cast iron play a key structural role, not merely serving as supporting elements. Now, ask yourself the crucial, piercing question. Where did all that metal come from? And not just metal, but high-quality, processed, standardized material. At that time, according to the official story, the main mode of transport was the horse-drawn carriage, and global standardization was unheard of. The industry they describe to us consists of rudimentary, slow, and inefficient factories. To smelt the thousands of tons of cast iron we see in just the facade of one train station, millions of tons of charcoal or coke would have been required. Can you imagine the sheer volume of timber that would have had to have been harvested? All of Europe should have been turned into a bare, barren plain. But it wasn't. The energy and raw material balance simply do not add up. Historians, with years of practiced composure, assert, all of this was designed on paper by candlelight, then cast and assembled by hand. But the laws of physics, chemistry, and logistics begin to fracture under such claims. The biggest inconsistency lies in the issue of precision. We are talking about thousands of beams, joints, and parts that were supposedly produced in different workshops, perhaps by different workers, on different, non-standardized machines. Yet, they fit millimeter by millimeter. Without computer modeling, without CNC machines, without the measuring equipment available today. This borders on statistical absurdity. The scrap rate should have been catastrophic, and construction times should have stretched into decades. But this did not happen. To fully grasp the magnitude of the fraud, we must examine the two crowning achievements of this technological absurdity: the Crystal Palace in London and the Eiffel Tower in Paris. These two structures will be our guides in this investigation, as they embody all the impossible technological paradoxes of the 19th century. We begin with the palace. It is not just a building. It is an architectural fabrication of 1851, erected in an unbelievably short period of time. Remember this rule. When official history cannot explain how something was done, it always starts telling the story of who did it, emphasizing the genius of one person. Here enters the figure of the gardener, Joseph Paxton, a man who spent his life building greenhouses, suddenly, as if by magic, creates the engineering design for a structure covering 90,000 square meters. The time frame, a few months. 4,500 tons of high-quality cast iron. Tens of thousands of glass sections. Show me the logistical chains. Show me the mines and blast furnaces that operated at this impossible level of productivity. And most importantly, show me the thousands of horse-drawn carts that must have paralyzed London to deliver those multi-ton beams. There is no mention of them in the newspapers of the time. This is the first and most obvious clue of a logistical collapse, leading us to a shocking conclusion. These buildings were not constructed from scratch. They were most likely assembled or reassembled from prefabricated components, leftovers from a previous, more advanced civilization. But why did they need to conceal them? And why did one of the most grandiose symbols of the era, the Crystal Palace, burn completely to the ground in 1936 in a fire that seems to have required the temperatures of an industrial furnace? This is not a conclusion. It is only the beginning of a chain reaction of questions that inevitably leads us to the Eiffel Tower and even darker discoveries. The cluster of questions planted by the Crystal Palace demands an immediate harvest. We touched upon how quickly it was built, but let's truly dive into that quickly. We are talking about a building with an area of over 90,000 square meters, like a massive glass city under one roof, erected in just a few months. Official history attempts to smooth over this fact by placing all the credit and glory onto the shoulders of one man, Joseph Paxton. They call him an architect, but his real background? He was essentially a head gardener. A man brilliantly skilled at building greenhouses, suddenly, as if by magic, creates the engineering design for a structure covering 90,000 square meters. The time frame, a few months. 4,500 tons of high-quality cast iron. That is, tons of ore to be extracted from the earth, and tens of thousands of tons of coal to be burned in the furnaces. Now look at the statistics. The metallurgical industry of Great Britain in the mid-19th century, even at its peak, could not spare this volume of resource in such a compressed time frame without paralyzing all other strategic industries. If all British factories had suddenly switched solely to the needs of the Crystal Palace, the construction of ships, bridges, and locomotives in the country should have ceased. Yet this did not happen. The industrial production figures given to us by historians leave no room for the Crystal Palace. This cast iron was not just mass, it was an example of perfect casting. Look at the surviving elements. They are elegant, artistic, intricate beams with high detail. And most importantly, they are standardized. Thousands, tens of thousands of parts that had to fit into slots and joints with pharmaceutical precision. This was an era of hand-fitting, where every factory used its own measurements and standards were merely a dream. If this casting had been done using the traditional technology of the time, it would have been crude, uneven, full of defects, and would have required months of manual finishing for every beam. But the palace was assembled like a construction kit in record time. This is possible only under one condition: if these parts were manufactured on an assembly line, using high-precision, standardized machines and made from a material superior in its properties to ordinary puddled iron. The most suspicious part of this entire story is the palace's ending. In 1936, decades later, the building, consisting of cast iron frame and glass, completely burned down. A fire that transforms thousands of tons of metal into shapeless ruins. Cast iron does not burn under normal conditions. To achieve such an effect, temperatures available only in industrial blast furnaces or through the use of special fast-acting mixtures are needed. The hypothesis that this was an accident sounds like a mockery of common sense. It is far more likely that this was a cleanup operation. The palace, like other grandiose world exhibition pavilions, was not just a beautiful decoration. It was a piece of evidence that held too many technological secrets from a previous civilization, concealing the evidence and convincing us that we live in the age of clumsy steam, is the true meaning of this sudden and all-consuming fire. But if the Crystal Palace was just the first call, then our next object, the Eiffel Tower, is an overwhelming alarm bell that cannot be ignored. If the palace was assembled from ready-made, elegant components, the tower, with its 7,300 tons of puddled iron, demonstrates the absurdity of logistics and assembly on an entirely different, extreme level. If we thought the casting precision of the Crystal Palace was impossible, how do we explain the phenomenal accuracy of 18,038 parts and 2.5 million rivets of the Eiffel Tower? Our investigation continues, and every rivet holds its own, equally chilling secret.
We left the Crystal Palace in clouds of suspicious ash, but its technological successor, the Eiffel Tower, rises over Paris as a 7,300-ton, massively reinforced question mark. If the palace impressed with the speed of its cast iron assembly, the tower stuns with its absolute precision and the use of what is called puddled iron. What is this material? Puddling is the process of obtaining relatively pure iron from cast iron through the hellish labor of manually stirring the molten metal. This is an incredibly inefficient method that is physically incapable of ensuring the material's homogeneity. Every element produced this way should have internal stresses, slag inclusions, and varying strength. According to the official version, there are 7,300 tons of this material in the tower, and it still stands today, enduring wind, temperature fluctuations, and millions of visitors. This is either a miracle or a lie about the origin of that iron. It seems far more logical that the tower is made of high-quality, already prepared steel, which was then labeled puddled iron of the 19th century for the sake of the legend. But the most incredible thing is its assembly. Let's recall the figures that sound like a verdict on the official version: 18,038 metal parts and 2.5 million rivets. Imagine this. Each of these parts must have pre-drilled holes for the rivets, drilled on the ground before lifting. This is not just 2 million holes, it is 2 million pairs of holes that must align with an error not exceeding tenths of a millimeter, so that a glowing rivet can be inserted into them. And all of this without computer modeling, without modern CNC machines, without laser and optical measuring systems. If 19th century workers drilled these holes manually or with primitive presses, the scrap rate, that is, the misalignment of holes, should have reached critical levels. This would have necessitated manual adjustment of every second part, making the claimed construction time, 2 years and 2 months, absolutely unrealistic. The only explanation for such phenomenal accuracy is that the parts were not manufactured in the 19th century, but on equipment capable of producing standardized, interchangeable elements on an industrial scale and with high precision. Even photographs of the construction itself raise many questions. With such labor-intensive and incredibly complex work requiring thousands of skilled workers, we see a suspiciously small number of people in the pictures. The construction site does not look like a bubbling cauldron of manual labor. Instead, you often see already finished gigantic blocks being lifted and installed like pieces of a huge construction kit. This site seems too sterile, too organized for what is described as the age of clumsy steam. This is not construction. It looks like the assembly of salvaged fragments. From an economic standpoint, the tower is also an absurdity. 7,300 tons of a strategic resource, iron, that could have been used to build a fleet or thousands of kilometers of railways was spent on a useless tower, a temporary structure for a world exhibition. Why such a colossal, strategic waste of resources? If it was merely a decoration, then why was it given such an incredible margin of safety and durability? The answer lies in functions that have nothing to do with an architectural monument, but we will discuss that later. Now, let's expand our investigation beyond these two giants. The accumulated evidence, impossible precision, unexplainable metallurgical productivity, logistical failures, and suspicious fires points to a global picture. The most terrifying part of the investigation awaits us: the demographic paradox of the 19th century, the lack of human resources, and the energy balance that does not add up in either coal or timber. This leads us to the idea that the entire industry of the 19th century might have been just a screen, covering the fact that the factories were not production workshops, but warehouses of finished products inherited from a previous vanished civilization. Leaving behind the perfect precision of the Eiffel Tower, we are forced to question the very existence of the society that supposedly built it. Our accumulated evidence, the absurd speed of construction, the impossible quality of metal, and the absence of logistical traces takes our investigation to a global level. We are facing a demographic paradox. Look closely at the photographs of cities in the mid to late 19th century. They look eerily empty. Grand avenues, majestic buildings, but where are the millions of inhabitants? Where are the dense flows of pedestrians and carriages, characteristic of any major city? Where are those thousands of skilled workers, engineers, founders, and miners who should have been serving this incredibly complex, bustling industry? The impression is that the cities were either recently founded or, and this is more alarming, recently settled. This suggests a hypothesis about a shortage of adult, trained population. Where then did the personnel come from, capable of operating the most complex equipment and producing those very standardized parts we saw in the Crystal Palace and the Eiffel Tower? Official history offers no satisfactory answer, but alternative theories point to a catastrophe, a sort of great reset that led to the disappearance of the majority of a highly developed civilization. The new, young societies that emerged from the ruins simply did not have the necessary number of adults and qualified people.
This demographic failure is directly related to the energy balance that does not add up. We have already stated that to smelt thousands of tons of high-quality cast iron and iron, millions of tons of fuel, charcoal or coke must be burned. If the 19th century industry operated at the claimed scales, Europe and parts of North America should have been ecologically devastated, bare mountains and scorched forests. But this did not happen. Where are the mountains of slag heaps that should have remained after such colossal metallurgical work? They are absent. This brings us to the chilling probability. The metallurgical industry of the 19th century was essentially a fiction. The factories shown to us were most likely not production workshops, but warehouses and repair bases for finished products inherited from the previous era. We did not need to produce metal from scratch. We simply reassembled it, using foreign technology and foreign raw materials. This explains the incredible quality of the metal, the lack of grandiose slag heaps, and the enigma of logistics. There is no need to transport ore and coal in unimaginable volumes if you are operating with already finished beams. And here we return to the world exhibitions, the main tool for concealing and reappropriating history. These exhibitions, held worldwide, served as the perfect cover. We are told that the grandiose pavilions of stone and metal were temporary structures made of plaster and sticks.
but by studying old photographs and architectural plans, we see capital, monumental structures. Why? Because these exhibitions were not merely displays of achievements, they were cover operations for the methodical destruction or rebuilding of ancient cities that survived, but did not fit into the new ideology. The construction of the Crystal Palace and the Eiffel Tower is perhaps just an imitation, a diversionary tactic. The real work was finding the surviving high-tech buildings of the previous civilization, dismantling them, renaming them, and destroying those that too clearly contradicted the new myth of the age of coal. That is why so many grandiose pavilions burned or were demolished immediately after the exhibitions ended, the destruction of evidence under the pretext of economic inexpediency. But what was all this for? Why spend so much effort concealing the past, staging technological backwardness, creating the myth of the Iron Heroes? The reason lies in the very purpose of these giant metal structures that we mistakenly call monuments. They were not symbols of pride. They were part of a global, now disconnected system. We have discovered that the 19th century is an era of falsehood. Metal was not produced in those volumes, the population was insufficient, and architectural masterpieces were built with impossible precision.
Now, to understand the motive for the concealment, we must change our view of the objects themselves. The Eiffel Tower and the Crystal Palace are not just monuments. The first and most obvious piece of evidence pointing to a global catastrophe is hidden right beneath our feet. In many old, majestic buildings around the world, in St. Petersburg, Paris, New York, an inconvenient fact about the depth of the foundations is discovered. Full-fledged floors with beautiful vaults, windows, and even doorways turn out to be deep underground. Historians insist that this is a cultural layer accumulated over centuries. But does a cultural layer accumulate in perfectly even horizontal layers? In reality, these are the traces of a catastrophic mud or debris flow that covered cities, literally burying entire lower levels. Our young society simply excavated what it could and declared it its own, appropriating the buildings of the previous era. This explains why many 19th century structures look so majestic, yet are functionally unsuitable for the needs of the age of steam. This brings us to the true function of the metal giants. The Eiffel Tower is not a symbol of Paris. It is a disconnected generator. The spire of the tower is not merely an ornament, it is a classic lightning rod or antenna, designed to work with atmospheric electricity, or as it was formerly called, ether. The tower, with its colossal mass and complex conductive structure, was part of a global network capable of extracting and distributing free, clean energy. Similar elements, spires, domes, metal crowns, were installed on almost all large buildings at the time, including the Crystal Palace, with its huge metal frame. The new masters of the world did not need free electricity. Free energy means independence, freedom, and prosperity for everyone. Their goal was the exact opposite: control and servitude through the introduction of paid energy. Coal, oil, gas, these are not just resources, they are tools of control. The destruction of the global etheric network became the greatest act of sabotage in history. The demolition of World Exhibition pavilions, the suspicious fires of the Crystal Palace, and the great city conflagrations between 1812 and 1850, these are not accidents. This was the destruction of evidence and the methodical transfer of humanity into a technological dead end.
Remember Nikola Tesla? His ideas about wireless and free energy were ridiculed. His projects were shut down, and his documentation was seized. He was the last to try to restore the lost technology, and his attempt was severely suppressed.
And finally, the darkest secret related to the demographic paradox, the artificial restoration of the population. As we established, after the global catastrophe, there was simply a shortage of adult, trained people. This is where the orphan trains fit into the picture, running across the USA, distributing hundreds of thousands of children of unknown origin, and the mentions of strange baby pavilions at those same world exhibitions. This is a grim but logical hypothesis. A program for settlement was initiated on the ruins of civilization to create a new, compliant society. We, the people of today, are a cargo civilization. We live in magnificent houses, but do not know who built them. We walk across bridges without knowing the principle of their operation. We revere the Eiffel Tower and other iron frameworks, considering them architectural monuments, when in reality they are disconnected generators of life, headstones over our lost memory and stolen freedom. And until we recognize this lie, we will remain merely tenants in someone else's scenery, forced to pay for energy that should be given to us for free. History lives when it is told. Subscribe. What comes next you have probably never heard before.